The playing field is constantly changing. So when new technologies come in, you need to reimagine your game because the playing field is changing and the new technology brings in new capabilities that you can use to play better.
Expanding possibilities, the mindset zone.
I'm your host, Anna Melikian. I'm here to support you, increase your impact while preventing burnout. The Mindset Zone is a place to pause, increase your self-awareness, and embrace the experimentation mindset. Find more resources, including information about the Mindset Zone book and audiobook at mindset.zone. Yes, instead of .com is .zone. Today, our guest is Sangeet Paul Choudary, a global keynote speaker, a best-selling author of several books, including the newest, Reshuffle, Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. So welcome to the Mindset Zone.
Thank you, Anna. Such a pleasure to be here.
And since I found you in Substack, I really was wanting to have you here in the Mindset Zone because you are thinking about all this AI disruption by a systemic angle that I really appreciate. And I remember the piece that I first found you in Substack was one that you were speaking about how everybody's speaking about job loss, how AI will replace us, and then now we are saying a lot in the online world that first we are going to be replaced with somebody using AI, and you are pointing that this is a short sight view and very limited view of the changes that AI is going to create. So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because there's been this common trope that's circulated around a lot and still goes around where people say AI won't take your job, but someone using AI will. And I believe that's a fallacy because you are in that, when we use that sentence, we are thinking about jobs as stable constructs within stable systems. And you either get to improve your ability to perform that job using AI or somebody else does it and takes it away from you. So all of that assumes that jobs will not really change. Jobs will be largely stable constructs. What we really see, and I like to take the example of what happened when the word processor came in and impacted the role of typists. What we see is that jobs are actually created in a certain system, larger system of work, which is a larger workflow, a larger organizational context. And when that changes because of technology, the job may no longer need to be structured in the same way as before. So if you think of the example of the typist, and I like that example a lot because when you think of the typist, you associate the typist's job with the task of typing. So you would assume that if technology helps you get better at typing, as a typist, word processors would not take your job, but a typist using a word processor would take your job because, after all, your job is typing. What really happened was that when the word processor came in, the task of typing still remained a human task. It still stayed with humans. But the job of the typist was no longer required because the task of typing could now be performed by anyone. And the reason for that was that the job of the typist was not defined by the task of typing, but by the constraint or bottleneck of editing. Because before the word processor, editing was expensive. It required a lot of manual effort and a lot of manual expertise. And the real role of the typist was structured around that particular constraint or bottleneck. And when the word processor took that bottleneck away, took that constraint away, that job was no longer required. So my key point is, let's think about when AI comes in, how does it change the larger workflow? How does it change the larger organization? And even organizations themselves change in response to how companies decide to compete. How are companies competing in your industries today? And with AI coming in, will they use a different way? Will the nature of products change? Will the nature of their differentiation change? All of that will change your workflows, and that will change what is constrained versus a bottleneck or not. So it's not your tasks, it's the system and what is a bottleneck in it that determines your job.
And let's unpack this because there is a lot of good stuff
Right.
here. I like that you do that differentiation. You speak about the tasks that somebody with a certain job has certain tasks, like the typist. The task was typing very fast, efficiently, without mistakes, because that create more efficiency in the system. But then there is the workflows, and then
Right.
there is the systems when this happens, and there is the ecosystems where this happens.
Absolutely.
And you are helping mainly leaders to see the big picture here, to think in terms of systems and ecosystems. And you say in your book that you don't have a crystal ball to preview what is going to happen in the future, but you are providing a frame of reference that people can use to be able to identify opportunities in the future. And I really like that, because I think most people that I see out there are speaking about this almost like an addition and subtracting game. So if I put this, I get more productivity, I save more money. And they are not seeing the AI disruption as really a reshuffle, the name of your book, that will allow us to create different games that are not played yet. You will agree with that?
Yeah, I that is absolutely right. I absolutely agree with that. And I actually say this towards the end of the book that we need to understand that today we're in a world where the nature of the playing field is constantly changing, which means that you no longer, if you're a car manufacturer, you're no longer just in the automotive industry. You're in the electrification industry, you're in the connected data industry, you're in the sustainability industry, you're in multiple different industries. So industry boundaries are no longer static. And what that means is that the playing field is constantly changing. So when new technologies come in, you need to reimagine your game because the playing field is changing and the new technology brings in new capabilities that you can use to play better. And there's a reason, if you look at my book Reshuffle, I deliberately selected what I would call dumb technologies because we think about AI, we always think about intelligence. Is AI like a human? Is AI as good as a PhD? I've taken examples of shipping containers or barcodes, two-way radio communication. These are technologies that fundamentally restructured entire systems, how trade was done, how wars were fought, how power was structured between retailers and brands. And the point that I want to make is even though we can't predict the arc of technology accurately, we can see that even with the dumbest of technologies, systems completely change once they are successfully adopted. And that's the opportunity with AI today to reimagine our systems around whatever AI can already do.
And sometimes it's the small details that then create the difference. I always think when now we are using so much in the speaking world, when we have a slide, we put our QR code. And QR codes were there for a long time. But there was a time that the first launch of the QR codes, we had to have a specific app in our phone in order to be able to read the QR code. And that created a friction that didn't lead to a wide adoption of it. In the moment that somebody realized, why don't we make the camera of the iPhone without any extra app to read the barcode and to take to a website, suddenly the dynamic changed and QR
Right.
code became a thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's a great example of the fact that it's not the capability of the technology that determines how behaviors and larger systems change. It's really the adoption of the technology by the system. And what prevents or aids that adoption are two things. One is what I talked about in terms of constraints or bottlenecks. And so the fact that you had to actually download an app was a bottleneck that was creating the drop off. And the flip side of looking at the same thing is what enables your technology to be adopted is complementary technologies around it or complementary capabilities. So the camera adopting the QR code interpretation within its functionality is a complementary capability that drove the adoption of the QR code. So those two things are absolutely essential when we think about how technology can reshape our systems.
And also the speed of adoption, because I keep thinking about why AI was and the chat GPT was so around to 100,000 users so quickly comparing to other recent technological revolutions. But it makes sense because if we think about in the end of the 20th century, internet came out, but who had a computer? Not many
Right.
people had the computer. And then we had to have a phone, we have to dial to the modem. There was loads of constraints. So it took time to adopt that. Even with social media that started in the 2000s, was after only the smartphones, 2007, that it became a thing because we had social media in your hands. But with the ChatGPT, when it came to the open for everybody to use, you need a computer with internet or a device with internet.
Mhm.
Most people in the Western world already have those things to access that technology.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've seen repeatedly with technology since it's whenever a new technology comes in, the better the complementary capabilities that are already available for the adoption of the technology, the faster it gets adopted. In the past, if you wanted to get a fax machine, everybody had to invest in a fax machine. And initially, with the rise of the internet, the having a computer was again something that determined how fast you could get access to it. So that's certainly something that has changed ever since. And that's why today, when we build new networks, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, ChatGPT, eventually they're all building on top of existing adoption of technology. And the second piece is the cold start problem, which essentially means the amount of initial work that a user needs to do before they can see value from a particular technology and or a particular solution. And a simple way to think about it is if you wanted to use Facebook, you needed to first connect with your friends to start seeing something in your feed so that it would become usable. So there was some work involved over there. And Facebook had this internal metric that users who connect to 10 other users in the first 7 days are likely to be active. So that was something that determined how fast the solution was adopted. But by the time TikTok came in, TikTok used AI to completely eliminate the need for connecting with your friends. You just had to interact with content and your feed would be populated on that basis. And I think ChatGPT's adoption also follows that arc because ChatGPT is such a horizontal solution in terms of its use case. There's a way it applies to everyone. There's no upfront setup effort or costs, whether labor or monetary, and you can just start working with it, and it is something for everyone. And so the horizontality, the lack of upfront setup, all of that helped drive its adoption as well.
And we have to think of all these elements and see how the game is changing. Because, again, going back to the historical perspective, when Edison started with electricity and the lamp and all of that, oh,
Mhm.
it's going to replace the candle or the oil lamp. How great is that? But if we think about all the implications, what electricity allows us to do is much
Right.
bigger than that. Is what they call a general purpose technology that change everything. So how do you help leaders really to see this as an opportunity and to have the right mindset to see opportunities?
Yeah, the example of electricity is very pertinent. I also take the example of the shipping container, which is also very interesting, and I'll just very briefly talk about it because it relates to how we think about AI as well. So when the shipping container came in, people thought it was the advantage would be port automation and dock workers would lose their jobs. But the real value of the shipping container was when intermodal transportation started happening, which means the same container could move across ships, roads, and rails, and that dramatically brought down the cost of logistics, enabled global supply chains, and unbundled manufacturing. You could manufacture using components created elsewhere in the world. So our whole globalization and new system of trade started around the shipping container. And I think that's a great illustration of how things are about to change because of AI as well, because of a couple of things. The first thing is that the shipping container, if we take that example and stick to it, it standardized the unit of physical trade and hence rewired the workflows of trade where something could be produced, who could produce it, by making the flow of goods frictionless to some extent or reducing that cost, improving that reliability dramatically. And AI today does the same thing to knowledge work because knowledge work has historically been tightly coupled with the people who can learn and perform that knowledge work. And now with AI, we have technologies that allow knowledge work to be performed without requiring you to incur in hiring the same level of labor or investing in the same level of skill development and education. And when that happens, when you start modularizing or breaking up knowledge work and making it accessible, you can restructure how your workflows work. In the past, if in order to set up a workflow, you needed to train and hire people, and now you can do it without that, where that work can be performed, who can perform it, and how it can be structured can be completely changed. And so it really starts with thinking about how is the fundamental way in which work is performed, how is that changing with AI coming in? And that is why it's not just about this task is going to be taken up by AI or by a person using AI. It's more about now that these tasks can be performed independently of the skills and training and the labor that was associated with it, how can we reorganize how we create value around that? And that's really what I help companies think through. What do these new workflows look like? How does this change their advantage if they were structured around unique ability to hire certain kinds of skills and manage those skills internally, and now those skills are available more generally? How does it change their ability to compete? Those are things they need to think through.
And that is fascinating. And for everybody, I really advise to read the book because you see the containers, when we think about in the first view, what is the big deal? But you give the concrete example of make Singapore the hub now of international finance and also a vibrant place because
Right.
they leveraged the advantage. They really saw the game changing and they really went all in on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the advantage, that's the opportunity for companies today because Singapore reimagined what a port and a country could do around the capabilities of this new technology. There were a lot of ports like Bangkok and other ports in the region which also modernized their ports and hired cranes and set up cranes. But that's just like saying we're using AI tools. We are improving our processes by X% because we're using AI tools. But Singapore reimagined what a port and an economy could look like around the new logic of the container. And that's what firms need to do today. They need to reimagine what their business should look like around the new capabilities that AI provides.
And another thing that I love about the container example is that he also create problems that possibly they didn't foresee because now we have the access. What are we doing with all these containers that were used and now are? And there are this new industry that is repurposing of the containers.
Absolutely. I think every new system that gets created around these technological shifts or around any shift, every time a new system gets architected, there are second and third order effects that did not exist beforehand, that you could not have anticipated, that you need to work through. And I take the example of even though containers enabled globalization, they also created a new kind of inequality because there were certain countries which would export more than they would import, or there were others which would import more than they would export. And so there was a balance of having to pay for the empty containers one way or the other that created a certain inequality in trade and prevented some countries from participating in global trade until that problem was solved. And we're going to see the same thing with AI when it gets adopted. It's not going to be shared prosperity. There are going to be new forms of inequality that come up as well.
And how what we do in response to that is the key. How we handle all those dynamics, that is the key. And that takes to the other thing, and going back to your book, because you start in the first chapter of the book, you speak about, again, Singapore and COVID, how in
Mhm.
the beginning they were so good in controlling the spread of the virus and
Right.
how they use technology to contact tracing to help keep things under wrap. And
Mhm.
then they forgot the human factor and things got a little bit awry. So, can you tell the listeners a little bit of that story?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. I actually lived through it because I was there. So, Singapore was very good at contact tracing. And unlike other countries where there was a lot of resistance to surveillance by the state, Singapore is a much more compliant society in general. And they were very effective with contact tracing. There were very good policies or very effective policies to restrict movement. But what ended up happening was that there was a fault line in the system. And that's what I talk about in the book, that while all the restaurants and other establishments were closed, there were these KTV lounges. And KTV stands for karaoke lounges, but they're not the standard karaoke lounges that we think of. These are basically adult entertainment venues where businessmen meet to strike deals, and there are women who entertain them over there while all this is happening. What ended up happening was that these women, who are called hostesses, one of these women had entered Singapore through what was called the familial ties lane. It was a special lane open just for families to reunite. The rest of the borders were closed. And what ended up happening was this woman came in using that particular visa and illegally started working as a hostess over here. She had come in with the COVID virus. She was working as a hostess, and men who were visiting would keep interacting with her, catching the virus. The way the hostess model works is the same person moves from room to room. And so it was the classic case for spreading all of that. COVID spread, and there was a COVID outbreak that happened just at the time when Singapore had everything under control. And it so happened that even though the rest of Singapore was very good with contact tracing, the men who went there did not want to show up and get checked for COVID just because of their reputations at stake. And so the second wave of COVID that broke out is a classic parable on our over reliance on technological solutions to counter larger systemic effects, but we underestimate the cracks in the system, the human cracks in the system that really account for these unanticipated consequences. And so it's a really interesting example of getting everything right and still failing where it mattered the most.
And it reminds me a lot that, yes, we have to help leaders to see the big picture, to see the system, to see possibilities, to reinvent, reimagine the game, and do not forget the human factor, because that is there as a big role. Even I always like to remind people several Nobel Prizes of economy are given to behavioral economists
Right.
because what they point out is the human factor.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've tried to tease out as well, that as we start adopting AI, we need to ensure that we create systems that value the human factor in the right way, because there's a distinction between intrinsic value, which is the value that humans create in general, and contextual value, which is the value that they create in a certain context. And the example I give over there is, as the population, global population ages, there's growing demand for caretakers. So caretakers create a lot of value, right? But it's not necessary that all of the value they create will really be rewarded if they start being managed by algorithms and AI the way delivery workers and Uber drivers are being managed today. And so if those algorithms, which are matching caretakers to the elderly, only track certain activities that the caretakers perform and reward them on that basis, whereas elderly well-being is more on the other factors that we think of as the human touch, and that's not really being monitored and rewarded, then you're setting yourself up for market failure. You're setting yourself up for creating skewed behavior of certain kinds, which would, where you're not really rewarding value as it should be. So it's really important that we build these systems around these technologies, that we think about those factors.
Yeah, to see the whole picture and the whole complexity of it. So you do the keynotes, you also work with boards, with companies. Where do you see the biggest resistance in the leaders? Where do you think that are the typical blind spots that they are facing?
Yeah, there are a few different blind spots that I see. The first is actually the central fallacy that I point out in my book, which is there's too much focus on AI as a machine that is performing tasks, and too little focus on how to think about what does this mean for my industry, what does this mean for my organization. So too little focus on the structural questions and too high a focus on the operational questions. How can I do something cheaper? How can I do it with less headcount? How can I do it faster? And those things don't really give you advantage. So that's one blind spot that's definitely there. I do believe that there's a lot of AI hype that's going on currently, which is fostering that blind spot further. Once we go through a period of disillusionment and come back to seeing where the real value is, we'll come back to really thinking about these systemic effects. The second issue that I see with how leaders think about it is that they're too obsessed with thinking about, are we buying the best technology? Are we buying the best? What is the the studies that are performed are also benchmarking technologies on performance of certain tasks. Even from a deployment perspective, leaders are thinking about what's the performance metric. Whereas what they should be really thinking about is what is our context, what are the workflows we need to think about, how are we competing, and given that context, how does the new logic of how our firm works changes, and in order to work with that new logic, what types of technologies do we need? So you really need to start not from the technology, you need to start from the problem you're trying to solve, the capabilities that you need to assemble to solve that problem, and then when you know what those capabilities are, think about what technology helps you achieve that.
When I was reading your book, I was imagining it's a lot like we have this big machine, and that the company is with loads of different moving pieces, and you almost are inviting leaders to let's break the machine down in all the components
That's
and
right.
look what each one, how do you say, I think a Lego set is even a better example for this. All the little pieces, let's take everything out, and then let's look to the pieces and how can we reassemble this with the new thing that we call AI, that is this also encompasses many different things. And how can we reimagine something new from it?
That's absolutely right. Because the central idea that I talk about is your workflows, your organizations, your industries, these are all systems that were structured around certain assumptions. Think about how those assumptions change with AI. And then when you break apart the Lego pieces, what are the new ways you can reassemble them? A really simple way to think about it is how the music industry used to work. And I use this example in the book. The music industry worked on the logic of the album. Music labels produced albums which were about artists putting out 10 songs. You might want just one or two of them, but you would have to buy the whole album. But it was structured around the assumption of retail sales. And retail sales meant that whether you sold one song or 10 songs, the cost of selling the song was the same. And so, in order to charge sufficiently, you had to sell the album. With the internet, that logic of the retail sale broke down because now you could transfer music over the internet, and so the cost of moving music around went to zero, which is why individual files could move around. Napster happened, then iTunes happened, and then eventually we realized that the real value in music was discovery, in identifying which music you wanted to listen to. And so while the album was structured around the logic of the production side, who's the artist, what's the cost of moving music, Spotify's playlists, in a way, are structured around the idea of the consumption. What does the consumer listen to? What kind of a mood they are in, and so on. And so, what we saw with music was unbundle what used to exist and rebundle the Lego pieces again. And that's the mindset that we need to bring to everything, to our workflows, organizations, industries, business models as we move forward.
Then bundle and then bundle it together, and the phases that things goes, because I remember of the music industry first, the biggest one of the big shifts was Apple, that okay, you can download, like you're saying, one song instead of
That's
the
right.
album, one song. And then when they brought a lot of people into that model, we can do our playlists, but then Spotify come and say, oh, if we can bundle just one song, why not make it live easy that you pick one song and you get all the other songs from it that
That's
you
right.
really like without you to have to make the effort of it, and then become a subscription model. And I will argue that another, we cannot, again, my background is the psychology, the human factor, so by default I always go back there. But if we think about the music industry, is very interesting for me that younger generation now are rediscovering records,
Mhm.
physical records.
Right.
And you go to stores where you can buy the physical records in different colors, in different editions, and they have a record player in their rooms and they are listening to the physical record. That I find that is fascinating.
Yeah, I think there is a cultural cycle that works whenever technology goes through this unbundling, rebundling. It all sounds very neat when we say, oh, music is like Lego and you break it down and you reassemble. But music is really an entire experience. It's a connection a fan has with a form of music, with an artist. It's a cultural maturing that an entire generation has around a particular form of music. And I think this return to vinyl is just one of many examples of where that cultural cycle is now moving. Because if you if you put in the Lego block logic and completely start breaking apart anything, you start taking away a lot of things that used to give it meaning in the first place. Those things that gave it meaning may not have been part of the economic value chain. The economic value chain might have been albums and songs and retail shops, but this whole cultural aspect around it, what you associate with, the idea of a collector, all of these things start getting lost in this idea of unbundling and rebundling. And so some of that gets reclaimed in the way that is happening right now, as you point out.
That is, and this the complexity and the opportunity that we have here. We really, because that is the advantage of the disruption that is happening. We have the opportunity of creating something better, not just add to what is already here. So, how can people learn more about you and your work?
You can look up Reshuffle the book on Amazon. It's available over there. I write regularly on my Substack, which you kindly pointed out earlier. It's called platforms.substack.com. I write there every week on these topics. And you can also look up my website. It's platformthinkinglabs.com. So these are three avenues to look it up.
Yes, so I will make sure that they are on the show notes, including your LinkedIn profile, because you put also great content on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
And let's keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Expanding possibilities, the mindset zone.
If you can think of a person who will find this episode helpful, please share it. Spreading the word about the Mindset Zone podcast is very powerful. For extra resources, including information about the book and audiobook, Mindset Zone, Actualize Your Human Potential, go to mindset.zone. Yes, instead of .com, it's .zone. As always, I'm so grateful that you are here. Expand what's possible for you, for the ones around you, for the world.